and moderated by John D'Angelo, EVP and President of Northwell's Central Region.
I kind of felt a little disappointed that we got stuck with barriers. That sounds pretty negative. So there's a lot of optimism today. There's a lot of great things happening. It's incredible the pace of what's happening in the industry. So we'll talk about the challenges and barriers, but I have a feeling what we're going to hear is some optimism and how we're going to address and overcome those barriers to take full advantage and realize the potential of what we're talking about. So I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves briefly and give a little bit of their background, and we'll get into that. And I'll start with Doug. He's not.
Everybody see me and hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, I joined the FDA in 2020. I was a physician and then a venture capitalist for 30 years. And then I was a big critic of the FDA, and Josh finally asked me, hey, why don't you stop bitching about things, come here and help me fix it. So they were getting kind of overwhelmed by COVID material, and I decided to move to DC and do that. So I was in charge of the Medusa 5 negotiation. I was the head of strategy for that, I should say. I started a program there called TAP, the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, which is essentially a way to bring all the stakeholders together that you need for commercialization at the very beginning of the process. And it's funny. I think maybe the only venture capitalist in HHS. So it's a funny place to be.
Thank you, Doug. Jeff?
Yeah, so I'm the reverse of Doug. I started my career in government. I was a military officer. They paid for med school and my PhD, both. So thank you, U.S. Army, go Army. And so after that, I was your classic clinician scientist, and then the war broke out, and I had to go to Afghanistan and Iraq and do that sort of thing for a little while. But when I came home, they sent me to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where I spent 13 years. And I got the privilege of founding the biotech office at DARPA. So I was the founding director of the biotech office at DARPA. And after that, when I got so short and fat and ugly, the Army kicked me out. I had to go find gainful employment, and I started a couple of companies. I started 5, actually, and so they're all actually remarkably alive and well. One just got sold, yay. So so I've seen both sides of this thing. And I did spend a short time, 2 years, on President Obama's staff in the Office of Science Technology Policy, which I think will be relevant to some of this discussion we're going to have today.
Great, thank you. What's interesting is we're hearing about the pace of innovation, the level of sophistication that's occurring out there. And we've heard sprinkled through the talks today various barriers. But they tend to come down to a few key components that we've heard today. Trust being a big one. Trust in the validity, hopefully the lack of bias in the data, the security, reliability, those sorts of things that all drive trust. And then what do we need to adapt or change in the regulatory process to bring all the stakeholders, as Kevin alluded to the table to fully leverage this technology and AI what's at our doorstep. Let's go to the trust part first. There's a lot of ethical concerns about this technology, how it's used, the reliability of it, the challenges that may present. You want to give us your thoughts on that?
Sure. Trust is key. I think that Jill pointed out beautifully in some of her comments, and as well as the previous panel, that trust is ultimately what really matters in terms of adaptation of any of the things we're talking about, be they the technology things from my world, being some of the genomic things in Dr. Ventnor's world, on and on. It's all about trust. And I think it was point out loudly and clearly, the COVID vaccine failed in about 25% of the patients. Why? They didn't take it. They didn't take it. So that could be the greatest thing in the whole wide world, but you know what? If it sits on the shelf, it's a science fair project. It ain't worth nothing to nobody. So, and that is all about trust. Right. And we are an interesting profession in medicine. We take an oath. Not too many professions actually take an oath. We take an oath. And our oath is, of course, in any way you want to translate it, is to the betterment of the patient. It is a beneficent oath. It's what it is. But yet we seem to have lost track of that. And the scientists, too, do what they do because they want to do good. They want to do good. They're not out to destroy mankind. They want to do good. But there is a distrust now, and that is a big key element. And how do you face that up front then? Because we have to head for, we're talking about all the great stuff all the technology is going to do, but at the end of the day, it's a double-edged sword. So I'll give you a story from DARPA. So I don't know if any of you guys know the name J.C. Lickletter, all right? So J.C. Lickletter, you can look him up online, is considered to be the inventor of the World Wide Web, the internet. So when he was at DARPA in the 60s, he started a program to connect different government computers to talk to each other so that they could use a central computer to do their computation. That's really what he wanted to do. So Dr. Lickletter was a genius. I mean, when he thought of this concept of cloud computing, and there was no cloud. But I will absolutely promise you that he never thought that somebody was going to use it to purvey child pornography. And that is what I'm talking about. There's always a double-edged sword. So how do you get ahead of it? So at DARPA and with President Obama, I'm happy to say, we started something called the ELSI panels, ethical, legal, and social implication panels. And that is bringing together stakeholders, in our case, physicians, clergy, community leaders, and of course, patients, so they can discuss those elements that are of relevance to ethics, legal, and social implications. And legal, by the way, is not first. Legal is a very low bar, right? Ethics is the highest of all bars. And so you have to have these discussions up front. And we can have a long discussion about that, but the point is you have to have those discussions up front. And then whose responsibility is it then, you would say, to do this? It is our community. The scientists have to be part of this conversation. The providers have to be, and on it goes. Because a lot of us are now dumping it onto the FDA and the NIST, quite honestly, National Institutes of Standards and Trademarks. And so it is not just FDA, it's also NIST. But are they the right group? Ask yourselves this: do you want the government agency to tell you what's ethical? I'm just throwing it out there. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Doug.
Well, I think it's okay to throw it over in the following context. You know, the stakeholders required for commercialization of almost every medical product, it's very different from biotech and medtech. And so where an AI falls under medtech, where for tech, the major risk inflection point is not the FDA study. It's whether or not you can get it paid for at the end of the day and get widespread distribution. So you have to have the assent of patient advocates, you have to have the assent of physician professional societies, and ultimately payers, including CMS. So what we've chosen our charter to be at FDA, in addition to safety and efficacy, is essentially bringing together all these really siloed stakeholders to have this conversation about these things. Because at the end of the day, it's a conversation and an agreement amongst all the stakeholders, and one base, as you've been talking about, on trust, that gets you to the answer that you want to get. We have our own ethical concerns, and we spend a lot of time talking about it in terms of products and how they're evaluated and how they're used. It definitely goes into the risk-benefit calculation that we look at when we consider if we're going to approve something or not. But I have no problem if the FDA is put in a role, since we are the first institution that people come to that really asks, prove it. You say you can do this stuff, now prove it. So our point of view is that we're not the only ones going to ask this question. So rather than have people go through serial failures when they prove it to us, but what we're looking for may be a little bit different than what, say, CMS is looking for, or what the American College of Cardiology is looking for, or whatever. Instead, bring everybody together. Let's have a conversation about the totality of what you need to prove your point, whether that's ethics or value proposition or efficacy.
Thanks, Doug. And what do you see, Doug? I'm going to go back to you for a second on the pace of which we see the pace and the inflection point we're at with the pace of technology. Do we need to rethink or rejigger the pace of which we're able to bring things to market safely? And what's the FDA's kind of position on that or role in that?
Well, now if you look at, say, for a medical device, the time from, say, product ideation all the way to profitability is probably 20 years. No investor in their right mind invests in a 20-year project unless they can get out of it much earlier. Now, you can do that in biotech, again, because the post-FDA pathway is so transparent and relatively predictable. But in devices, it's not that way. So we have to figure out a way to much more parallelize the existing process to make it much faster. And again, we do that by bringing everybody together. But The other way that we do it is by FDA needs to be much more in the community than it has been, and much more in the centers of innovation than it has been, because our biggest problem at FDA is that we're almost always reactive to new technologies. If you think about stuff on the biotech side that's been going on, CRISPR, and CAR-T and gene therapy, they've done a pretty good job of getting out in front of this stuff by being relatively well integrated in the community. We need to do more of that on the device side. Part of that, too, is that we talk a lot about innovation. We don't have a lot of innovators in the government in the way that we traditionally think about innovators. And the way I used to do it as a venture capitalist was I would prowl the hallways at Stanford or Harvard or whatever, looking for new technologies, talking to people all the time. We are starting a program with that within the TAP group. We're putting FDA people in every major innovation hub in the United States to do exactly that, to be much more predictive of what's going on. And it's not just us, because CMS is always asking us, what's in the pipeline, what's coming, because they have to get ready to write guidance for new technologies that are coming in so they can pay for it. Right now, that happens completely reactively. So they could spend, I'm not picking on CMS, but they could spend a lot of time just, wow, we've never seen this before. We really got to think about this a lot, because the necessary conversations and the trust relationships have not happened yet. So that's, I think we can do a lot more by bringing more innovators into the FDA, or spending a lot more time with them where they live, and then listening to those conversations and being ready. I'll give you an example. So we have a digital health center of excellence that had been relatively reactive to a lot of things. And so we were looking for a new head, and so I reached out to a guy named Troy Tasbaz, who'd been the senior VP of strategy at Oracle, and a very senior guy there who'd had his wife had her own health issues, and it sensitized him to the necessity for people from industry to come to the government to tell them how things are innovated, and then to be very prescriptive to industry about do this, don't do that, and make it much more easy for innovators to understand what they need to do. In the course of that process, that conversation that happens between people coming to us, new technologies coming along, it happens much faster. Now, one of the previous speakers was talking about how the pace of adoption of technology has gone from a decade to a couple of months in the case of ChatGPT. FDA is never going to be in a position where we're going to be able to react in a couple of months. But it's probably good to have a little time to sit back and think about, is this good for patients? Have we really thought about all the problems? Because the run fast and break things doesn't work so well with patients.
Great, thank you. So in that notion of keeping the patient at the center, thinking about all the the ethical, but also the promise of the technology, as these big data world comes together, patient privacy, concern about their private data, where does that line, how do we?
So data management, especially in this world now where data is growing, exponentially, is always going to be a problem, right? And how do you manage it? Because once you let it out, it's out. Especially in the world that we live in right now. It used to be a single document in a patient's chart. Now it's electronic. It can go absolutely anywhere. Again, this becomes it becomes one of the major problems, because one of the big things on the LC things that you talk about always is privacy. And privacy doesn't have to be just their record. It can be anything. It could be their genomic data. It could be their brain signaling. It could be any number of things. In the world that I come from, BCI, brain-computer interfaces, your brain signals that's valuable data. That's very valuable data. So as valuable as, I would argue, the genomic data that Dr. Ventnor talks about. If I know your brain data and I know your genomic data, I know you. So, and do you really want that? So, and in some cases you do. Because if you're sick and you're coming to your physician and you want, to be treated appropriately, you're going to have to give up some of that. So then it falls in the world of autonomy and responsibility. So what we want to do is, of course, to empower patients. That's really what we want to do, and we do have a responsibility to do that. But the line of responsibility gets kind of hazy, right? We talk about a lot of the technologies that come out, but if something should go awry, whose fault is it? Is it the user's fault, or is it the manufacturer's fault? And where does it lie? And a lot of these new technologies come out, they want to avoid FDA. They do. They think of every possible way they can avoid FDA until tragedy happens, because tragedy always happens. We're dealing with sick people. We're not dealing with well people. So when tragedy happens, who are they going to shovel that responsibility off to? They don't want to be sued. They're going to try to sue. So that's why we are assistant, because you, Dr. John, in your ED, you're responsible. And so when all hell breaks loose, guess what? They come knocking at your door.
Right.
And so why are then you so conservative? Because when the judge calls, you're the one who's going to be standing before him with your pants down. So that's the way that's the way our system works. So there's a lot of these kind of situations where you have to think about these ahead of time. That's why I say this again and again. At every level is trust. And I want to talk about CMS for just a moment.
Please.
So many of you know CMS, the National Deputy Chief Medical Officer is Shari Ling, and that happens to be my wife. So Shari has Shari has a very different viewpoint when it comes to paying. She actually views herself as responsible. She's a physician, she's a geriatrician, she still practices also. She has the afternoon clinic in the Baltimore VA on Monday afternoons if you ever want to find her. But the point is that she feels that she has responsibility to the taxpayer. Am I getting this value for that taxpayer's dollar? When they said the government should pay for this, government's you. Where do you think they're getting their money from? They're getting it from you. And so you want to be sure that, yeah, well, I'm paying for X, Y, and Z. And of course, the recent Alzheimer's drugs is a good example of where VA, to give them credit, first came out and took a stand. In spite of FDA approving the drug, VA said, no, not going to pay for it. There's no value here, right? And then CMS, as you know, followed on. Because at the end of the day, when they looked at that price tag, remember, it's a zero-sum game. It's a zero-sum game. If they get $5 and they got to take care of 50 million Americans who qualify for things, somebody's going to get something and somebody's not going to get something. So CMS is a hard thing. So what can you do? I was on the Govy side. So Govy to Govy. There's a lot of Govy can Govy. So when I was doing my brain, one of my BCI programs at DARPA, we actually brought in Victor Krauthammer, who's a senior FDA officer. He was brought in to help me review the proposals to do this $150 million project, and he stayed with the program the entire time. You know, there was Dr. Lee from the TTT, the Technology Transformation Team, I think that's what it's called, Doug. He came from the get-go, reviewed proposals, carried all the way through. This is how you can reduce some of the barriers. When Govy starts to work with Govy, right, so that early on you have the funders, i.e. DARPA, the regulators, i.e. FDA, the payers, i.e. CMS, all at the table at the beginning. Why? Because they can ask their questions as the development is happening. The scientists want to do their work. Just tell them what else you need done, and they will do it. And as a funder, I can give them the cash to do it.
100% agree. 100% agree. I mean, it's so important, and we don't do enough of it now. It's almost like there's a lot of outsiders and a lot of pressure from the Hill to you stay in your lane, and then CMS, you stay in your lane. It makes no sense, because what innovators want to know is, what do I got to show you? Just tell me what I got to do up front, and I'll go do it. Or if you tell me I have to run the Framingham Heart Study and have 24,000 patients to study people over a couple decades, then I won't waste my time. And what we're really looking for is efficiency of the use of government assets and efficiency of the use of capital, because what we see right now is the failure rate for technologies that come to FDA is insanely high. In part because most of the people that come, at least for CDRH, 70% of the people that come to CDRH, it's their first time there. They've never been there before, and so they have no idea about quality systems, about what payers I have to talk to. They have no idea about practice guidelines. What's my publication strategy? Do I need to be in? What kinds of journals do I need to be in? Do I need level 1 evidence? High impact journals. They don't understand any of this stuff, and in fact, most of the people at FDA don't understand this stuff. They know the FDA lane. And so the problem is that we're all far too siloed, and the answers come far too late, and the failure rate is far too high to really fix a bunch of major public health issues that we need to fix. So I completely agree with you, and that's why we're engaging. I have people in my program at FDA detailed to CMS, in part so we can figure out how they think and what their process is. And then ultimately what I'd like to see, especially in the next MDUFA discussion or in maybe the Cures 2.1, is a way that we can interact much more early, because CMS wants to know from us in the coverage analysis group, like, what's coming down the pipeline. And I would love it if they could come and have people from CMS come and sit with us when innovators first come to us and say that, okay, we're going to need to see this. It's going to be in this patient population. It's got to be this amount of duration, has to have this amount of durability. And because what we hear, exactly what you were saying, I hear from people at CMS all the time. We want to be good stewards of the trust. And I think that's a good place to be.
All right, I want to wrap it up and ask you guys, we've talked about the silos, we talked about the various and maybe potentially competing stakeholders, payers, public, what words of optimism can you leave us with? I mean, we're in a really incredibly exciting time. So how do we take advantage of that and go forward?
Well, you should be optimistic. This country is full of wonderful technologists, scientists who are constantly trying to push the edge of the frontier. We have a society that's based upon challenging norms, challenging convention. That's the strength of this country. Go elsewhere in this world and try to find the same thing, right? We also have an opportunity for, if you succeed, you will benefit from it. Nobody's from the government's going to come in and suddenly become your partner, right? From the government. So there is an incentive system in this country, and I want to come back to the very first thing. We as physicians have taken an oath. We believe in that oath, and we will take on anything and look at anything if we believe it will benefit our patients. But at the end of the day, we are our patients' advocates. We have to keep them from bad things, and we got to give them the good things, and that is why we tend to be a little conservative. But at the end of the day, we want them to get better.
Well said.
And
All
I
right.
think that, from the FDA point of view, and the venture capitalist point of view, who's somehow ended up in the FDA, I have a lot of faith that things are really happening. This de-siloization that I talked about is happening right now. When we reached out, when we first started these programs at the FDA, we reached out to American College of Cardiology and Ami Bhatt, who's their head of innovation, and told her, we want to prepare you for a bunch of innovators that are coming to you. So let's figure out a structure within ACC that allows you to help them with the stuff that they need to know from that. We also have been talking to CMS and the private payers about this. We've brought in patient advocacy groups to tell them the same thing, because a lot of innovators don't really talk to patients. They may talk to the one doc that invented the procedure and that his or her particular practice, but that is not necessarily representative of what patients look like across the disease spectrum across the country and demographics and what have you. So having these conversations, it's happening. When I first got here, I thought this is going to be like tectonic plates and we're just going to have to wait for the occasional earthquake. But to my great astonishment, we're seeing these tectonic plates move in real time. It's happening because we're having a conversation. A lot of people have been trying to figure out, how do we talk to the FDA? In the same way that I've always been trying to figure out, like, how do I talk to CMS, or how do I talk to Aetna or whatever? And we're having those conversations now, and this is going to happen not 20 years from now. It's happening right now. So if you're going to start a company, this may be one of the best times to do it if you're thoughtful and think holistically about the problem and are willing to engage and understand that this is not a brief point in the company's existence. I'll do my R&D, and then I'll hire a promotional sales guy from J&J to come run the company, and then I'll just bludgeon everybody until they adopt the technology. Instead, get broad consensus, do the hard work of generating the data, and understand that clinical trials and clinical evidence is your biggest competitive asset, and you better not try to cheat that.
All right, so I want to thank our guests. It's really exciting. You guys made my job easy. Appreciate that, and a lot to look forward to in the future. Thank you.